Today we are gonna get a brief introduction into clay and the various stages of clay before we fire it. And to do that, we're gonna make some pinch pots. So let's start. So a lot of people forget to start with pinch pots when they want to become potters or they want to work with clay. And pinch pots are actually a really good place to start because they're one of the first ways humans manipulated clay to make something functional and beautiful out of it. And so I have no scientific proof about the story that I'm about to tell you. However, I claim it to be true as the first origin of a pot. I imagine that the first piece of pottery was made by a teenager. And I imagine they're sitting around a campfire or in a cave with their parents and older adults and being slightly annoyed or bored at whatever the parents are talking about. And so they picked up some mud and they made a nice sphere out of it. And then because we like to destroy things, because we like to do that, I imagine they would stick their thumb on the inside and start messing around with it. So you can see I've poked a hole in it, not all the way through, but leaving enough room at the bottom that I can reach inside. And what you're gonna do when you start with your pinch pots is you're gonna act like your left hand is the pottery wheel, and it's gonna slowly rotate the clay into a circle. And your right hand is gonna serve like the tool, and it's going to slowly pinch the clay as you're spinning. Now, some mistake people make when they're first making a pinch pot is they think they can just hold it with this hand and then pinch around the outside. But as you contort your hand to do weird things, it's going to make the walls uneven. So if you can use the same amount of pressure in about the same spot and slowly turn the pinch pot, you can get really nice, even, tall walls. Another thing you're gonna notice as you're pinching the walls up is you're gonna notice the cracks that are forming on the outside and around this part of the clay. And what you need to do in that case is called compressing the clay. And to do that, you're just gonna squeeze the clay together and then smooth it over. And you wanna do this as the cracks appear, because as you keep working, they're gonna start getting bigger and bigger. And so you wanna compress them as you go. So I imagine the teenagers sitting around and messing with this clay so that they're more entertained than listening to their folks. And then when it's time to go to bed, they throw the piece of clay into the fire and go to bed. And the next morning, the parents pull out the piece of pottery, and now it's hard, and they can use it to store water or food. And they go, "Look at this great invention I made!" And the kids are like, "Wait, what about me?" And I don't have any proof that that's how it happened, but just don't claim it on like an anthropology test or anything like that. So you can see I've started to smooth out most of the cracks. You'll also notice that I really haven't used a ton of water, and that's another big mistake that people do is they'll put a ton of water over the surface, and it almost becomes like, here's an example, I'll put some water on this side. It almost becomes too slippery, like you can't actually make the clay move because there's too much water on it. So if you're finding that you have put too much water on it, you can actually use your canvas table to get most of the water off your hands. You can roll it around on the table, get the water off. And then once there's not too much water, you can go back to smoothing. So for our purposes, we want these to have a nice little foot ring on the bottom. So once you think you have a nice shaped cup, the foot ring is gonna keep it from tipping over. It's also gonna make it look lighter, more aesthetically pleasing. So you're gonna have your cup, and you're gonna roll out a snake. Notice how long of the motion I'm doing to roll a coil. A lot of people's problems when they try to do this is they try to do little tiny short rolls, and then that ends up making a coil that isn't round all the way around. So to keep that from happening, you wanna do really long rolls. And when I'm making this, I'm trying to match it to the lip of the pot so that it looks like it was made together. Sometimes if you make this too fat or too thin, it doesn't look like it goes with the pinch pot. So then you're going to make a ring. One ring to rule all the pinch pots. All right. Then you're going to place that ring on the bottom of your pinch pot and take a needle tool to mark out where that ring is going to go. And even if I smoothed this out, something that happens in the kiln is the clay tries to pull away from itself, so you can't attach smooth to smooth edges. You need to make it look like Velcro. So to do that, you're going to use your needle tool to scratch up your clay so it has some teeth. And then you're going to do the same thing to the ring. And you'll notice I'm not doing little baby scratches. Like, I'm getting in there and making scratches in at least 2 different directions to make sure it's like a checkerboard. And what that's going to do is when we combine them, it's going to make the clay like lock together, and then when it tries to pull apart, it can't because it's holding on to itself. So we're going to put those on, and then you can use either your finger or the back of a needle tool or any other sculpture tool that you have to smooth it out and make it look really pretty or aesthetically pleasing. It's the fancy term for pretty. All right, so what you're going to do, your first assignment if you're learning about clay, is I would suggest making 3 of these, and then we're going to do 3 different methods of drying them or trying to keep them more moist, and we're going to see what happens to the clay. So finish your 3 cups and then we can get to either wrapping them or doing the next step. So first goal is to make 3 of these little cups. Once you have your 3 cups made, there's 3 different ways you're going to store the first cups. The first one, you're just going to leave out in the air to see what happens overnight. The second one, going to gently wrap up in some plastic. You're going to let it sit like that overnight. And the third one, you're going to take a bucket of water and you're going to put it inside the bucket of water. So I don't know if you can see, but it's floating around in there. And we're going to see what happens over the next evening. So luckily I had some pieces of pottery that students let me borrow. This one I wrapped up. This is actually a thrown and trimmed piece that they wrapped up. And you can see that it's still about the same color as the regular clay. Here is an example of a piece of pottery a student made. This is a pinch pot with designs on it that they scratched and attached on, similar to how they did the foot ring. You can see there are 2 different colors. The one that was air dried is a lot lighter. We have some different vocab terms we use for these to describe them. It's kind of like they're all called greenware before they've been fired. It's similar to how shapes is like a category, but then if we want to define that further, we can say circle, triangle, rectangle, so that we have a better understanding of what we're looking at. We have similar terms for greenware to help us describe what we're talking about. So this stage is called leather hard or cheese hard, and it actually, if you were to press on it, it kind of feels like a brick of cheddar cheese. And this is the strongest stage of clay. You'll notice that I can't squeeze it and squish it into a shape like I could before it had dried out a little bit, but what I can still do is take a tool or my nail and I can make marks in it. This is the stage whenever we're gonna alter something, if we're gonna trim the bottom, if we're gonna put a handle on it, if we're gonna cut 2 pieces apart and put them together, we wanna do it when it's leather hard because the clay is really strong. The next stage of clay, this is the one that was left out overnight. This is called bone dry greenware. And bone dry is, it's dry as a bone. Most of the water has evaporated off of it. This is the weakest stage of clay. So once it gets to this point, you really don't want to mess with it that much because it's so fragile. There are ways that you can try to rehydrate this kind of clay, but it's very tricky, and let me show you why that's tricky. A lot of people think that if you just put the clay into a bucket of water, it'll rehydrate it. As you can see from this example from last night, this is a few pieces of pottery I put in a bucket of water, and it has now become this. This is called slip, and it's liquid clay. Anytime clay is allowed to be in water for a long period of time, it turns into slip. You also will get this all over your hands when you're throwing. Traditionally, slip is used for making castings. So if you ever go into like a Target or a JCPenney's and you see all of the pottery that's out there and looks all exactly the same, there's an artist who made one of those, and then they make a plaster mold from that piece, and then you pour this liquid clay into it and it makes perfect replicas of whatever the first one was. So this is slip. It still counts as greenware, even though it's not really anything functional. And then again, the other 2 terms are leather hard, and that's the strongest stage of clay, and bone dry. So now you know the 3 different phases of greenware. We have the slip, which was the liquid clay, the leather hard, which was when it was strong and you couldn't squish it, but you could mark it with a tool, and then it became bone dry. So those are all versions of greenware. So now you know the 3 different phases of greenware. We have the slip, which was the liquid clay, the leather hard, which was when it was strong and you couldn't squish it, but you could mark it with a tool, and then it became bone dry. So those are all versions of greenware. Once we fire it the first time, we do what's called a bisque firing, and then it becomes bisqueware. You can see there's a drastic color change, but you'll also notice if you click on it, it sounds a lot more like glass versus if you hit this one, thud, 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 and it still marks the clay a little bit. So bisqueware, once it becomes this phase, if you put it in water, it's not going to dissolve. It's still porous, so it wouldn't work necessarily as a functional piece of pottery for liquids, but this is the phase that we want to glaze it at. And then once we glaze fire it, and we'll talk about that more in a different video, once you glaze fire it, it's called stoneware. So we have greenware, bisqueware, and stoneware. Be serious in my talkies, right?
Yeah.
I get this thing. Be the outtake reel. Long motions. Long motions. Not this. Yucky, yucky, yucky. Not good. Makes yucky boils. That.